Look in your eyes, but all I could do was sigh. When you looked into mine, I saw love divine.
Carmine Persico Jr. was born on August 8, 1933, in Brooklyn, New York, to parents Carmine Persico Sr. and Assunta Plantamura. Carmine had an older brother, Alphonse, and a younger brother, Theodore. The Persico family lived in the Carroll Gardens neighborhood in Brooklyn. By the age of 16, Carmine had stopped attending school and would join the South Brooklyn Boys, an Italian-American street gang made up predominantly of young men involved in petty criminal activity. Carmine's brother, Alphonse, was also a member of this gang, likely having joined before Carmine. On May 12, 1950, the South Brooklyn Boys would get into a fight with a rival gang, the Tigers. When the fight was broken up by police, 18-year-old James Fortunato was discovered with a gunshot wound to the back. Fortunato was a member of the Tigers and would be pronounced dead at the scene. Members of both gangs would be arrested, including 16-year-old Carmine Persico and the shooter, 16-year-old Anthony Scarpati. Scarpati would go on to plead guilty to the charge of manslaughter, receiving a sentence of 15 to 30 years in prison. Persico and the others would be released after their charges were dropped. On the evening of January 9, 1951, Carmine and Alphonse Persico were about to arrive at their house at 637 Carroll Street when they were caught by three rival gang members. One of them fired 2 bullets at the Persico brothers, with both striking Carmine in the legs. The 3 assailants fled the scene and Carmine was taken to hospital, where he quickly recovered. On February 23rd, Alphonse Persico would gun down 26-year-old Steve Bove. Bove was allegedly one of the gang members responsible for shooting Carmine the previous month. After the murder, police would immediately begin looking for Alphonse, who had already gone on the run. On March 2nd, Carmine would be arrested and charged with the murder of Bove. However, the charges would soon be dropped due to a lack of evidence. On March 16th, Alphonse would turn himself in to police and would be charged with murder. On August 7th, he would plead guilty to the charge of second-degree murder, and on September 12th, he would be sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. By 1952, Carmine Persico's chaotic and violent reputation had brought him to the attention of Profaci family capo Francesco Franchi Shots Abbatemarco. Abbatemarco ran several lucrative gambling operations and he had complete control of the South Brooklyn numbers business, making him one of the family's greatest earners. On March 25, 1952, several raids were carried out with the objective of arresting some of the highest-ranking figures in the Brooklyn numbers business. 8 Profaci family members were arrested, including Frank Abbatemarco, his son Anthony, and Carmine Persico. Also arrested were brothers Larry and Joe Gallo. Everyone arrested would plead not guilty. However, Frank and Anthony Abbatemarco would both later plead guilty, with Frank going on to receive a 1-year sentence and Anthony receiving 9 months. Persico and the others would be acquitted. Later, Persico would be formally inducted into the Profaci crime family under Abbatemarco, eventually growing close to the Gallo brothers, who were already official members of the family. By the end of the 50s, Persico's boss Frank Abbatemarco had grown disillusioned with family boss Joe Profaci. He regarded Profaci as greedy and unreasonable and decided to stop paying tribute to him. As a result, Profaci would order Abbatemarco's own soldiers, Larry and Joe Gallo, to kill him. Profaci promised the two that they would inherit Abbatemarco's territories and businesses if they carry out the murder. The Gallo brothers agreed to this and began planning to kill Abbatemarco. On the night of November 4th, 1959, Abbatemarco had just stepped outside of Cardello's Tavern at 256 4th Avenue in Brooklyn when the Gallo brothers approached him. One of them would shoot Abbatemarco in the back, causing him to run back inside the tavern. Both gunmen followed him in and shot another 4 bullets into him, leaving him in a critical condition. A few hours later, Abbatemarco would succumb to his wounds, passing away in hospital. After this, the Gallo brothers would wait for Profaci to finally give them what he promised. However, he never did. Frank Abbatemarco's businesses would instead be taken by Profaci, who only allowed his own loyalists to profit from them. This absolutely enraged the Gallos, particularly Joe Gallo, who immediately began plotting to get revenge. They began garnering support from within the family to make their next move. Early on, Persico, who was already close with the Gallo brothers, would join their faction. By 1961, the Gallos had figured out and meticulously planned a way to get back at Profaci. On February 27, 1961, Larry, Joe, and their other brother, Albert, orchestrated the kidnapping of several Profaci loyalists. They kidnapped family underboss Joe Magliocco, Profaci's brother Frank, Capo Salvatore Musacchio, and soldier John Simone. The brothers intended on kidnapping Profaci as well, however he was able to escape, fleeing to Florida. During this time, the Gallo brothers would make demands to Profaci. They demanded Profaci hand control over Batamarco's businesses to them. They would also demand a payment of $100,000 in exchange for the release of their 4 hostages. They were able to make their demands to Profaci through family capo John Franzese, who was given the job of negotiating with them. Eventually, Profaci would give in and agree to meet the demands of the Gallo brothers on the condition they release their hostages first. Upon the release of the 4 hostages, Profaci would go back on the agreement and order the murders of everyone involved. On August 20th, 1961, Larry Gallo was summoned to a meeting at the Sahara Club in Flatbush, Brooklyn, under the pretense of negotiating a truce between the Gallo and Profaci factions. When Larry Gallo arrived, he would be ambushed by 3 men. One of these men would begin strangling Gallo with a wire, intending on killing him. This man was Carmine Persico. Earlier, Persico had switched to Profaci's side and was given the contract on Larry Gallo as a result. Before Gallo could lose consciousness, a police officer would walk in, resulting in the 3 men fleeing the scene. Later, Persico would be arrested for the attempted murder of Gallo. However, he would be released after Gallo refused to identify him. After Persico's betrayal of the Gallos, they would begin referring to him as the Snake, a name that would follow Persico for the rest of his criminal career. In November, Joe Gallo, the perceived leader of the Gallo faction, would be convicted on extortion charges stemming from his attempts to muscle in on a Brooklyn-based check-cashing business owned by businessman Theodore Moss, with Moss testifying against Gallo at trial. Joe Gallo would go on to receive a sentence of 7 to 14 years in prison. On June 6, 1962, Joe Profaci passed away from liver cancer. As a result, the family would be taken over by family underboss Joe Magliocco. After the death of Profaci and the imprisonment of Gallo faction leader Joe Gallo, the war appeared to slow down. However, it wasn't completely over. The Gallos were still gunning for Persico, resulting in 2 separate attempts on his life. Sometime in early 1963, the Gallos would have a bomb planted under Persico's car. However, Persico found the bomb before it could be detonated. On May 19, 1963, Persico, alongside another Profaci family member, Alphonse D'Ambrosio, were entering Persico's car on Bond Street in Brooklyn when a truck pulled up. 2 men began firing at Persico and D'Ambrosio, leaving them both wounded. Both men were taken to hospital, with them both ultimately surviving. Eventually, the war would officially come to an end after New England family boss Raymond Patriarca was able to successfully broker a peace agreement between the 2 factions. After the end of the war, family boss Joe Magliocco would conspire with Bonanno family boss Joe Bonanno to take full control of the commission by eliminating bosses Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, and a few others. Supposedly, this came as a result of Magliocco believing Lucchese and Gambino to have backed the Gallo brothers during the war. Magliocco would take responsibility for having the bosses murdered, delegating this monumental task to family capo Joseph Colombo. Instead of carrying out the murders, Colombo decided to alert Lucchese and Gambino to Bonanno and Magliocco's plans. This would result in both Bonanno and Magliocco being called before the commission to explain themselves. Magliocco attended this meeting. Bonanno, however, decided to flee to Montreal. The commission decided against having the 2 rogue bosses killed. Instead, they taxed Magliocco $50,000 and ordered him to step down as boss of the family. Upon Magliocco stepping down, Colombo would be appointed to the position of boss of the family by the commission. From this point, the hierarchy of the now Colombo crime family was Joe Colombo as boss, Salvatore Charlie Lemons Mineo as underboss, and Benedetto D'Alessandro as consigliere. Around this time, Persico would be appointed to the position of capo, with his crew being heavily involved in hijacking and loan sharking. During the 60s, Persico was engaged in a long legal battle stemming from his 1960 indictment for hijacking a truck carrying over $50,000 worth of merchandise. On May 9, 1968, he would be convicted after 5 trials due to the testimony of mafia informant Joe Valachi. He would receive a 14-year sentence shortly after. However, he wouldn't actually begin serving this sentence until January 27, 1972, due to an appeal. In April of 1970, family boss Joe Colombo founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League, a political group established for the purpose of challenging stereotypes about Italian-Americans and the mafia. Colombo decided to move forward with the movement in direct response to the arrest of his son, Joseph Jr. Jr. was arrested by the FBI in early 1970 for melting down coins for the purpose of reselling the silver. On April 30th, Colombo organized a protest outside the FBI headquarters in Manhattan, even having some members of his crime family attending the protest. From this point, the League grew more influential, with it receiving the support of many Italian-American politicians, and even Frank Sinatra, who performed at some events. Although the League provided a voice for the Italian-American population, it wasn't great for the Commission. In establishing the League, Colombo attracted a lot of federal attention to organized crime in New York. Allegedly, Carlo Gambino even forbade members of his family from attending League rallies. Despite this, the League flourished under Colombo and was a very positive force in Italian-American communities. However, things would only go downhill from here. On March 11, 1971, Joe Gallo would be released from prison on parole. Although his loyalists had accepted a truce with the Profaci faction, Gallo didn't. Colombo likely understood that Gallo would attempt to challenge him when he was released. As a result, he would offer Gallo $1,000 as a peace offering. Gallo refused to accept this and demanded $100,000, which Colombo refused to pay. From this point, Gallo would fully commit to challenging Colombo. He would begin building relationships with African-American gangsters, starting with future heroin kingpin Leroy Nicky Barnes, who he met in prison. Due to this, Gallo would have access to enforcers with no prior connections to any Italian bosses in New York. On June 28th, Colombo was on stage at a League rally in Columbus Circle, Manhattan, when he was shot 3 times. The gunman, 23-year-old African-American street hustler Jerome Johnson, hit Colombo in the head, back and neck, paralyzing him. Johnson was taken down by police officers when he himself was shot by Colombo's bodyguard Philip Rosello. Johnson was killed and Colombo was taken to hospital, where he would ultimately survive his wounds. Although he survived, he was completely paralyzed and had to spend weeks in Roosevelt Hospital before he could be taken home. With Colombo unable to ever return to the position of boss, a new boss would need to be elected. Initially, it was assumed that Colombo's underboss, Salvatore Mineo, would succeed him. However, Mineo felt he was too old to take over the family, with him retiring shortly after. Ultimately, the title of boss would be given to Joseph Iacovelli. After the attempt on Colombo's life, the family would arrange to have Joe Gallo killed in retaliation, assuming him to have been behind the shooting. On April 7, 1972, Joe Gallo was at Umberto's Clam House on Mulberry Street in Lower Manhattan, with his family and his bodyguards celebrating his 43rd birthday. While Gallo was dining with his family, a man walked in and began firing at him. He was hit and began running towards the door. The gunman kept firing and hit him in the back. With this shot proving fatal, Joe Gallo was taken to hospital where he was pronounced dead. After the death of Joe Gallo, his loyalists would target Joseph Iacovelli. After an attempt on his life, Iacovelli would flee New York, leaving his family without a boss. Due to this, Carmine Persico would be elected boss of the family while he was serving his sentence. Due to him being incarcerated, he would need to run the family through his brother, Alphonse. Alphonse Persico was Carmine's consigliere, being one of very few mobsters to be inducted when the membership books were closed from 1957 to 1976. In February of 1976, the membership books were reopened, and each family was allowed to induct 10 prospective members. Alphonse Persico would sponsor the inductions of his and Carmine's childhood friend and early criminal associate Anthony Scarpati and their close associate Gennaro Jerry Langella. Before their inductions, both Scarpati and Langella had spent years building their criminal businesses. As a result, they would rise the ranks fairly quickly. As for the Gallo faction, it had been disbanded after Albert Gallo was transferred to the Genovese family as a way to maintain order within the Colombo family. On December 15, 1979, Carmine Persico was released from prison on parole, finally allowing him to run the family himself. Soon after Persico's release, Scarpati would be made a capo in the family. One of the men working under him was Greg Scarpa, also known as the Grim Reaper. Despite his status as a soldier, Scarpa ran his own crew, operating on 13th Avenue in Brooklyn. Scarpa was also known for his brutality, being considered one of the Colombo family's most feared enforcers during his early career. At this point, Carmine Persico was at the peak of his power. However, he wouldn't be on the streets for very long. On August 11, 1981, less than 2 years after being released from prison, he would plead guilty to attempting to bribe an IRS agent, going on to receive a 5-year sentence. While he was in prison and his brother was acting boss, they would decide to appoint Jerry Langella to the position of underboss. In March of 1984, Persico would be released from prison. By September, Alphonse Persico had begun to suspect his girlfriend, 31-year-old Mary Barry, of being an informant. Due to this, he decided to have her killed, giving this task to Greg Scarpa. Naturally, he would need to get the approval of Scarpa's capo, Anthony Scarpati, who reluctantly agreed. Scarpati even said to Scarpa's son, Greg Scarpa Jr., quote, "We're probably going to go to hell for this." On September 24th, Scarpa had family soldier Carmine Cecil lure Barry to his club at 6908 13th Street in Brooklyn, under the pretense of giving her a job. When she arrived, she was caught by Scarpa and his son. Greg Jr. held her down while his father shot her 3 times in the head. The two men then left her body on a curb beneath the F train subway line in South Brooklyn, where it was discovered hours later. Also in 1984, the family would be dealt a crippling blow. On October 14, federal racketeering indictments would come down against several high-ranking Colombo family members, including the entire leadership. Indicted were Carmine Persico, Jerry Langella, Anthony Scarpati, and several others. When the indictments came down, Carmine fled to Hempstead, New York, where he would hide out with his cousin, Fred DeChristopher. Unfortunately, the person he chose to stay with was an informant who gave up his location to the FBI. On February 15, 1985, Carmine Persico was arrested by the FBI and held without bail pending trial. In the Colombo family case, all defendants except family soldier Ralph Scopo were held without bail. Scopo was only given bail due to his health issues. 10 days after, Carmine Persico was charged with several counts of racketeering in what was known as the Colombo family case. He would be indicted on charges related to a separate case. On February 25th, federal indictments would come down against the bosses of all 5 New York crime families and some of their subordinates. Some of the mobsters indicted were Gambino family boss Paul Castellano, Genovese family boss Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, Lucchese family boss Anthony Tony Dux Corallo, Bonanno family boss Philip Rusty Rastelli, and Carmine Persico. The case was brought by New York Southern District Attorney Rudy Giuliani, who alongside the FBI had been building a case against the New York Mafia for years using surveillance, wiretaps, and informants. The case was mainly based on the Mafia's alleged control of the construction industry in New York. As a result, indictments in this case would reach Jerry Langella and Ralph Scopo, who both had major interests in the construction industry. On June 13, 1986, the Colombo family trial would conclude with every defendant being convicted. On November 17th, sentences would be handed down. Carmine Persico was sentenced to 39 years in prison, Jerry Langella was sentenced to 65 years, and Anthony Scarpati was sentenced to 35 years. While this was going on, Persico was also being tried in the 5 Families case. During this trial, he would act as his own attorney, often meeting with his legal advisor. Also during this trial, 2 defendants would be dropped. Bonanno family boss Philip Rastelli was dropped from the case due to another federal indictment he was facing, and Gambino family boss Paul Castellano was murdered on December 16, 1985. On November 19, 1986, every defendant in the 5 Families case would be found guilty, including Persico, Langella, and Scopo. On January 13, 1987, the bosses and their subordinates would all receive 100-year sentences. With that, Persico was now serving a total of 139 years in federal prison. Despite this, he wasn't willing to give up his title of boss of the Colombo family, even though every one of his potential acting bosses were in prison, with Alphonse Persico also serving a lengthy sentence as a result of his conviction in a separate extortion case. As a result, from 1987, the family would be taken over by a ruling panel of three capos: Benedetto Aloi, Vincent Jimmy Angelino, and Joseph Tomasello. After a while, however, the family would be taken over by Vittoro Little Vicorina, who was entrusted to take the position of acting boss for Persico. As a result, Orina would order Carmine Persico, who is now the family's consigliere, to poll the captains on whether he should take full control of the family. Soon after this, Orina would petition the commission to recognize him as the official boss of the Colombo family. During this time, Orina was in a strong position as he had the full backing of Gambino family boss, John Gotti. Meanwhile, instead of doing what Orina ordered, Sessa sent word to Persico informing him of Orina's plans. Persico would then order Sessa to arrange Orina's murder. On June 20th, 1991, Orina was driving to his house when he noticed a car parked outside. This car contained 5 enforcers who were waiting for Orina to arrive home so they could kill him. However, Orina recognized some of the men in the car, and instead of going home, he turned around and sped away from the scene. After this failed attempt on his life, Orina would retaliate against the Persico faction by ordering the murder of Persico loyalist Greg Scarpa. On November 18th, Scarpa was driving in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn with his daughter and grandson. His daughter and grandson were in a separate car following him when a truck pulled alongside his car. Several men jumped out and began firing at him. Scarpa went down and then accelerated, speeding past a stop sign and escaping. Although Orina's faction seemed stronger, Scarpa had a resource that gave him a significant advantage. Since 1961, Greg Scarpa had been an active FBI informant. However, he wasn't an informant in the traditional sense. He had spent the last 30 years using his position to further his criminal career by playing both sides, and his connections to the FBI proved very useful in the war. During this time, Scarpa was receiving information from agent Lindley DeVecchio. DeVecchio was able to give Scarpa information on his enemies, allowing him to track them down and kill them. Scarpa also had little to lose by this point. In 1986, after receiving surgery for a stomach ulcer, Scarpa would contract HIV he received that was donated by an associate of his who carried the disease. Eventually, he would go on to develop AIDS, which during this time was a terminal illness. Scarpa would also be motivated to wipe out the Orina faction due to the fact that gunmen ambushed him in front of his family, which could have put their lives in danger. On December 6, Scarpa and a few of his enforcers arrived at 310 Bay 11th Street, the house of Orina faction soldier Vincent Fusaro. As Fusaro was putting up Christmas lights, Scarpa shot him with a high-powered rifle. When Fusaro was on the ground, Scarpa approached, stood over him and put another 2 bullets in his head, leaving him dead on the scene. From this point, the war between the Persico and Orina factions grew more heated every day. On January 7, 1992, Nicholas Nicky Black Grancio was sitting in his car in the Gravesend neighborhood in Brooklyn when Scarpa approached and shot him in the head with a shotgun, killing him instantly. Grancio was a capo in the Orina faction, making him the highest-ranking member of the faction to be murdered by Scarpa. Grancio had also been under constant FBI surveillance, with this only stopping the night he was killed. Also, in 1992, rival faction leader Vic Orina was indicted on several federal charges including murder, with him being arrested on April 4, 1992. Meanwhile, due to his illness, Scarpa had filed a lawsuit against the hospital that performed his blood transfusion, and on August 30th, he received a settlement of $300,000 from the hospital. Soon after he received the settlement, Scarpa was arrested for racketeering conspiracy and placed on house arrest. He was most likely granted bail as a result of his deteriorating condition. On December 22nd, acting boss Vic Orina would be convicted on racketeering and murder charges, going on to receive 3 life sentences plus 85 years in federal prison. On December 29th, Scarpa's son Joey told his father that he had been threatened by 2 drug traffickers and Lucchese family associates, Marvin Moran and Michael DeRosa. Joey Scarpa was allegedly also a drug dealer and got into an altercation with the two men as they had been selling drugs on his territory. Despite being on house arrest and wearing an ankle monitor, Scarpa went with his son and his friend Joe Randazzo to confront the two men. Upon arriving at DeRosa's house, things became heated and a shootout ensued. Greg Scarpa shot DeRosa in the stomach and Moran shot Randazzo in the head, killing him instantly. Moran also hit Greg Scarpa in the eye, wounding him. After this, Joey drove his father to the Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan, where he was arrested for violating the terms of his bail. By 1993, the war was over and the Persico faction had officially won. Not only was Arena in prison, but his closest ally, John Gotti, was also in prison. From this point, Carmine Persico would exert his control over the family from prison. As for Greg Scarpa, he was sentenced to life in prison on December 15, 1993, after pleading guilty to racketeering and murder charges. However, after a review, his sentence was changed to 10 years due to his condition. On June 4, 1994, he would pass away in the Federal Medical Center in Rochester, Minnesota, due to complications from AIDS. Carmine Persico would remain the official boss of the Colombo crime family until his death on March 7, 2019.